So welcome to this week's episode of Leaders on a Mission, where I'm joined by inspiring leaders driven by the impact of creating a healthy and sustainable world. Now, in today's episode, I'm joined by Jack Bobo, a leading expert on global trends in agriculture, food technology, consumer attitudes and perceptions, science and communication. Now, Jack has spoken on these subjects globally hundreds of times, so it's an absolute honor to have him on the show. Now, Jack has a really unique background in education, degrees in science and law, a master's in environmental science, careers going from an attorney all the way through the US Department of State, where he advised global food policy, through to senior positions in the biotech industry, now as a food futurist, really helping companies navigate the changing consumer trends landscape. So Jack, it's a privilege to have you on the show. Thanks for joining us today.
I'm really excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
Excellent. Did I get the intro right there, by the way? Was that a good intro or?
That sounded just fine. Thank you. Very great.
No, that's great. So maybe we'll take it all the way back to the beginning, as it were. So, as you were growing up, as it were, what were the major kind of influences that really helped shape the ideas and aspirations of a young Jack? And I'm thinking before your trip to Gabon.
Yeah, well, I grew up in southern Indiana, which is a very agricultural region. My family was not in farming, but the cornfields literally came up to our backyard. So we knew what farming looked like. We had a garden, though, and on this garden, we grew corn and peppers and green beans and cantaloupes and watermelons and strawberries and you name it. And my mother canned everything for the winter and made jams and jellies. So I never really thought of us as being in agriculture, but looking back, I realized we were practically self-sufficient, which is quite a unique thing. And, I told people that we were all organic because we had child labor, which was me and my brothers. And I certainly never thought that I would be working in agriculture one day, but I had this really great foundation in it. Another important impact on me, though, was actually my grandmother. And she had never really traveled. She actually came to Indiana in 1900 in a covered wagon from Kentucky. And the one thing about her, though, was that she loved to read. And every book she read during her entire life, she wrote down the number. And in her house, she had books, wall to wall, floor to ceiling, 3 deep in every room of her house. And so she was just this voracious reader. And I used to take her books, and my library is still filled with books from her library. And so it was somebody who really opened my eyes to the world in a way through books that, she had never actually been to these places, but it had a big impact on my desire to go and visit them.
Oh, great. And tell me, what did your parents do, by the way? What were their careers? And
I'm sorry, what was that?
What were your parents? What did they do for career-wise?
Yeah, so my mother mostly worked at home. She had a few odd jobs while I was growing up, but she was always there taking care of me and my 2 brothers. My father worked on the railroad, and he was a railroad engineer. And so he was really on the road 6 or 7 days a week, 365 days a year, traveling between towns. So it was a tough job. And the railroad's always been a very dangerous job as well. And so, I was fortunate that he came out of it mostly unscathed. But, it meant that he wasn't there a lot when I was growing up.
Yeah, no, got it. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. So tell me, if I was talking to you, we're going back to you being 13 or 14, that kind of age, what would you have, and I was having a chat with you now about what you wanted to do. Was there anything that resonated at that stage in terms of where you're, what you were really kind of interested and passionate about?
Yeah, I mean, at that time, I was reading a lot about nature and the environment and, books about, animals and zoology and things like that. So I really thought that one day I would end up working in sort of an environmental or biology field in far corners of the world.
Okay. And, you did. Okay. You foresaw that, did you? Right. Okay. Okay. No, great. And I know that the trip you had as part of the Peace Corps, to Gabon. That was quite an influential kind of moment for you in terms of setting some direction. And I saw your TED talk around that. You mentioned that. Maybe you could just kind of articulate or outline, what was it that really kind of evolved and changed for you, I suppose, during that trip?
Yeah, now people often say that people go into the Peace Corps to read a book, to write a book, or to decide what to do with your life. And so for me, it really had a lot to do with figuring out what I wanted to do. And at the time, I wasn't quite sure if I wanted to go to medical school or go off and do more of these global ideas of conservation. And I ended up in Central Africa in a small village in the corner of Gabon. And I was a science teacher. And so I really spent 2 years just in the middle of the rainforest, figuring out, what it was that I really cared about. And I really had that time for introspection because, today I'm sure that Peace Corps volunteers have computers and email and all of those things. But, for me back then, it took 2 weeks for a letter at best to travel back and forth. And, often it took a month or two. And so, I realized that, we had these amazing global forests, I was living in, and that I wanted to figure out a way that I could do my part to really protect those forests. And so when I came back, as an undergraduate, I had studied biology, chemistry, and psychology. And then when I came back, I went to graduate school and did a joint master's degree in environmental science and a degree in law, thinking that I was going to be right at that intersection of science, law, and policy.
Yeah, no, okay, great. Because you don't normally see that. I mean, it's quite an unusual path. I mean, I could see the undergraduate kind of science focus, and then the law and the environmental science is such a lovely kind of combination. And I think you've used those disciplines really well within the kind of career you've had, right?
I did. I mean, I've been very fortunate. I have put all of those degrees to work throughout my
Yeah,
career.
yeah, no, that's great. That's really good. And tell me, really interesting. I mean, your career, you were at the State Department from 2002 to 15, as it were. So, I know you had a multiple kind of roles and positions, as it were. But as you're reflecting back now, maybe just talk about a couple of maybe personal highlights or things that you kind of reflect back on really kind of fondly during that time.
Yeah. So when I first went to the State Department, I was working in the Economic Bureau and the Office of Food Policy. And I had originally thought that where I wanted to end up at the State Department is in our Bureau of Oceans, Environment, and Science, because that seemed like it was really focused on the conservation issues that I cared about. But as soon as I got into the Food Policy Office, I realized that it's agriculture that has, in many ways, the biggest impact on the planet. And I was right where I needed to be. And so the first few years I was there, I worked on food policy in Africa, food security, hunger, food trade, biotechnology. And then after a few years, I switched over and I was working on Asia food policy. Then I worked on Europe food policy. And then for a few years, I ran our global biotechnology program, where I had people who covered each of those regions of the world for me. And then my final few years, my only job was giving speeches. So I had an unlimited travel budget. I could travel anywhere in the world and just talk about the future of food, the role of science, and how do we better communicate with the public. So it was a really great opportunity.
Yeah, no, it sounds great. And during that time though, just interestingly, just around the areas of things like sustainability and climate change and the use of biotechnology, these are things that are really kind of at the fore of people's minds and opinions, really. Maybe tell me a little bit about how some of those kind of policies maybe evolved over time, or what
Right.
the thinking was in relation to those.
Yeah, so it's really interesting. I went there with pretty strong science background, and so I was really passionate about talking about the role of science and what science was doing and how far it had progressed and what it was going to be able to do to solve big problems in the future. And what I found is that a lot of people were pushing back on some of these things, particularly in the area of biotechnology and how science has actually caused problems related to climate change. And so what I realized is that, science at the beginning of a conversation never convinces anybody of anything. it actually just polarizes the audience. Those who agree with you more, and those who disagree actually disagree more. So I found myself turning back to my psychology roots, and I started reading about cognitive psychology and behavioral economics and marketing and advertising. I really wanted to understand, how do people come to believe what they believe and know what they know? And when do people change their minds? And so it really changed the nature of my conversations. I was doing presentations all the time. I gave, 500 presentations in 60 countries around the world. And I slowly just started taking all of the charts and the scientific information out of my slides and making sure that I was presenting it in a way that really connected with people, not overwhelming them with data, but providing information that helped to connect the science to their personal lives, so that they understood that we actually all share the same values. We're trying to leave a planet that's better for our children, but doing it in a way that actually resonated with people instead of sort of the standard government talking points. It made a real difference.
Did it? What kind of difference and impact do you think that that had?
Well, it's different how you're trying to convey information. So I'll just give you, one example that I was working on the trade negotiations between the US and Europe at the time, something called TTIP. And I was spending a lot of time in Europe speaking to organic farmers who were not necessarily that supportive of, what we were doing. And so when I talked to them, though, I would ask the questions like, well, what are the things you're worried about? And they were often worried about GMOs coming to Europe and being overwhelmed by big food companies from the United States competition. So I would point out that all of the GMOs approved in the United States are already approved in Europe. We don't approve it here unless it's approved in Europe, and so it really didn't actually impact any trade or any products coming in. And Europe wasn't producing those products anyway and didn't really have any intention. So there really wouldn't be much change with the negotiation. But when it came to big food products, well, every big food company in the United States is already doing business in Europe. So it was going to save them a little bit of money, but it wasn't really about market access. And so then I would say, what do you think the fastest growing part of the US economy is in food? Well, it's organic, artisanal, local, high-end quality products. And, those are exactly the things that they felt like they had a market advantage in. And that's what the negotiation was really going to do, is it was going to create this opportunity for small and mid-sized companies to have access to the largest organic market in the world. And that seemed like a pretty good opportunity. And so I think people began to see that, whereas what they had feared was already here, and the opportunity that they were missing out on might actually be better, they began to realize that there at least was worth a conversation, and that we didn't have to shut it down just out of fear or concern, but there was something worth talking about. And it's that de-escalation of tension and fear that's sort of been a hallmark of my career, I would say.
Yeah. And in that role, when you were working for the State Department, was it as much about influencing internally as it was externally with that? And your personal views and opinions on how you saw the future of agriculture and food?
It was. Well, I had this conversation with our trade negotiators as well, because they kept talking about how the trade deal was going to make food cheaper. And I kept saying, nobody wants cheap food. We want quality food at affordable prices. And they'd say, well, it's the same thing. I'm like, yes, technically it's the same thing, but it feels and means something completely different. And so actually around that time, I started doing a lot more of my presentations in the United States. I was traveling across the United States to help American farmers understand what it was we were trying to do, and to try to help them do a better job of communicating the work that they did, so that people would appreciate more the effort that went into producing the food that we enjoy.
Okay, great. That sounds like such an interesting job, global kind of position, and you sound like you had a lot of fun and a lot of enjoyment in that role.
I did.
Now, tell me, when you consider now and you look across, your viewpoint on the challenges around the suppose, food and agriculture, and the things that we need to, we need to concern ourselves with, looking ahead. What do you think the top two or three things that come to mind for you is when we think about the future and feeding
Yeah,
the world by 2050?
yeah. So, the challenges, of course, that we face, I think, are pretty well known. We have 40% of all the land on Earth is already devoted to agriculture. The amount of cropland is the size of South America, the amount of pasture land the size of Africa. So the footprint of ag is bigger than we'd want it to be. In terms of water, 70% of all fresh water goes to agriculture, so there's nothing bigger. Climate change, 10 to 15% of greenhouse gases come from agriculture, another 10 to 15% from deforestation, 80% of which is caused by agriculture. So, there's just nothing bigger in terms of land and water and climate than ag. And so, the challenge that we face is that we're going to have another 2 billion people on the planet in the next 30 years. And those people are going to be more affluent, which is a good thing. But that means that they're going to be demanding even more food and protein and other things than one would expect just from adding 2 billion people to the planet. We have 700 million people who are going to bed hungry today. So we're not even feeding the people we have. So we have this huge increase in population and demand for food. And yet we have these huge environmental challenges and stresses today. So we have to do everything not just better, but wildly better over the next 30 years. So, one is just, making sure that we feed all of those people. But then the second is doing it using less land, less water, less fertilizer, everything doing it on less than we do today. And we're producing 50 or 60% more. So, those two aspects are just a dramatic challenge, producing more, using less. And that's why innovation in science and technology are so critically important, because the only way you can accomplish those two things is with new ideas.
Yeah. Okay. That's great. Tell me, has the figures that you've mentioned there, they're start figures, they're quite scary looking at some of that. And there is a big challenge ahead. It seems to me over the last 3 or 4 years, there is an innovation bandwagon and science and technology kind of creating solutions to this. But tell me, I don't go back in agriculture for years and years and years. Is this just been over the last 5 years or so? And what really kind of changed to escalate the kind of innovation dialogue, as it were?
So, really in the last 50 or 60 years, science and technology have made dramatic strides. If we were farming today the way we did in 1960, we would need 1 billion additional hectares of land to produce the food we do. And to put that into perspective, there are only 3.6 billion hectares of forest remaining in the world. So we would need more than 25% of all the forest land converted into agriculture to feed people with 1960s technology.
Wow.
And so, because of that dramatic improvement in agricultural production, we do have increased, and deforestation is obviously occurring, but it would be wildly greater without those innovations. And so it absolutely has helped. 50 years ago, 1/3 of all the people on the planet went to bed hungry. Today, it's less than 10%. Amazing improvement. Now, 700 million people, absolutely unacceptable, but it's not that things are bad and getting worse. They're actually good and getting better, but not fast enough. And that framing of the conversation is so critically important, because many conservation groups feel that things are bad and getting worse. And if things are bad and getting worse, that makes farmers the problem to be solved. But if things are good and getting better, that makes farmers the solution to our problem. And if we want them to work with us to solve these problems, we can't demonize the work they do. We need to actually be congratulating them. And to put it in just a little bit more perspective, looking forward, the World Resources Institute, has their menu of change. What do we need to do to get to a sustainable agricultural future by 2050? And they list all of the things in productivity improvements and changes in human diets and all these things that we need to do in order to get there. But 61% of the change that must occur is baked into their analysis based on historic improvements in agriculture. Think about that. If we did nothing, farmers and agribusinesses and scientists would get us 2/3 of our way to our goal. So, but we all focus on the 1/3 that, hasn't been figured out yet. And we, complain that they're not more productive, that they're not more efficient, and so, I really think that, we need to focus on, the benefits that are coming from that system, as well as what else we need to do. I always tell people that, farmers were the traditional, they've been doing sustainability forever. It's just that we're finally getting on board with them, and we need to recognize that.
It's such a different framing, and I haven't actually had it described like that, actually. It's, it's more that you normally hear about the kind of panic and the fear out there, actually, and I hadn't heard that case being put forward, to be honest. It's very interesting and compelling, some of the numbers you've
well, it
mentioned
is,
there.
and it's important because science tells us what we can do, but it's the public that tells us what we should do. And that's why it is important that farmers and scientists and others do a better job of communicating why the science that they're doing is so important. Because it won't matter if we develop the innovations that could save the planet if we never get to apply those innovations to the problems at hand.
Yeah, absolutely. I know this is critical, and I was giving some thought to that beforehand. Like, is it just that scientists, being scientists, are not natural communicators of things other than science, and therefore that's where it goes wrong? What has historically been the problem?
Well, I was speaking to about 800 meat scientists a few years ago, and one of the things I told them is that if people don't trust you, science doesn't matter. And if people do trust you, science doesn't matter. Stop telling people what you do and tell them why you do it. Scientists are often just so excited by what it is that they do that they forget to tell their personal story. Why did they go into science? Because if people really relate to you and understand that you're working on their behalf, they often don't really care much about the science. And so, it's that we need to start a little bit earlier and have scientists sort of tell why they're doing things. And then, they can talk about their science, but science doesn't matter until you have trust. And, we need to do a better job of telling our personal stories. So I appreciate you're giving me the opportunity to tell my story.
Yeah, that's great. And also, I'm sure a lot of that to do, if you think about the story name. That actually, just thinking about what you mentioned there about the discussion with the meat industry, and I know, sorry, the discussion very much around at the time was the clean meat kind of movement, for instance, and which is obviously a super exciting kind of potential and future for food resource for people, but there's a whole kind of perception around the labeling of that and how the consumer would feel about that. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on some of the journey that you've gone on around that, actually.
Yeah, so I've been working in this area for a little while, and I was doing some consulting with the different food industry, and I realized that a lot of the companies in what's called the cell-based meat company, lab-grown meat today, the language they were using was very off-putting to be fair to the livestock industry. And at the time, the term that was being used was clean meat. Now, the people in the industry felt that clean meat was appropriate because they thought of it like clean energy, that it was safer and it was going to be better for the planet. But they really forgot that the term clean meat carries a lot of baggage with it as well, because it's not just a determination of how something is produced, but it has ethical implications for people, and that they were actually creating some of their own opposition. If I call something lab meat, you might think, yuck, I don't want to try that. But if I call it clean meat, well, it's an implication that the other meat is dirty. And so as a consumer, I kind of have to decide, do I want to continue eating this dirty meat, or and come over and be, one of the good guys, or do I want to continue to be evil? And that kind of framing, creates what we call dissonance. And so you either decide to be with them or against them. And if you're against them, it creates reactance where you actually want to actively work to undermine somebody. And when I would look at social media, that came through very clearly, that fighting. And given that we need to increase protein production by between 50 and 100%, it wasn't all clear to me what we were fighting about. The cell-based meat and plant-based meat industry could grow to be $1 trillion industry in the next 30 years, and not a single cow would disappear. And that's not likely to happen. So I spent a lot of time helping them to understand that it was really counterproductive. And I spent 9 months working with the industry. And by the end of that time, all of the companies agreed that they were no longer going to use the term clean meat. And many of the associations took them a little bit longer, but they also got on board. And so that's why today we talk about cell-based, cultured meat and other things. But, it's a concrete example of, trying to de-escalate that tension, because the tension was really unnecessary, counterproductive, and created all sorts of, pushback that undermined consumer confidence in all food. So it wasn't helping either side in that conversation.
Yeah,
And so
absolutely.
one thing I also want to mention is that, part of this difference between, consumers and the ag industry comes from how the public thinks about sustainability and how organizations think about sustainability. Because if I'm a consumer, I think of sustainability as, if you use less water, less fertilizer, less insecticides, you must be more sustainable. And that all makes perfect sense because, the environment around your farm must be better. But for many companies, they think of sustainability in terms of, the more intensively I can produce this food, the less pressure there is on global forest, on other places. So the more I produce here, the less I need to produce in other places. And so it's this difference between local sustainability and global sustainability. And there's this disconnect. And of course, we need both. But if consumers are only asking for local sustainability, when farmers and food scientists talk about the things they're doing, it doesn't actually reflect the kind of sustainability they think they need. And so that's where this disconnect occurs. And we need to have a better understanding that sustainability is a continuum and that there are trade-offs. If I use less insecticide on my farm, that means less runoff into the waters and local damage, but I'm just going to produce less food. So if I produce my food organically, it has a lower local impact, but a bigger global impact. Because instead of needing, 1 hectare of land, you need 1.3 hectares of land to produce that food. And so, the local people never see that 0.3 hectares of land because it's off in Brazil. And, this is something that I think people forget, in Europe, just as an example, that Europe has, in its farm to fork strategy, is focused more on local sustainability, want to have 25% organic by 2050 or 2030, sorry. And if you did that based on current assessments of productivity of organic in Europe from the European Commission, that's an 8% reduction in food production. So the #1 exporter of food to Europe is Brazil. So Europe is already exporting its environmental footprint to the most biodiverse country on the planet. And so, it's a trade-off. Europe can, have a smaller local footprint, but it will produce less. And if it produces less, somebody will meet that demand because they can afford to do it. And the people who produce it may or may not do it in as environmentally friendly a way as Europe could have done it itself.
Yeah, okay. Really interesting. Really interesting. Tell me, with the consumer ideas around, therefore, cell-based meat now, how do you think that lands with consumers in the future? And do you see more maybe involvement with that type of terminology as well?
Yeah, so it really plays into a long-term challenge that we have, is that, sort of, some people view science as the solution to our problems, and some people view science as the problem to be solved. And so if you believe science is the solution to our problems, you love the idea of cell-based. And if you don't, you're probably not. Winston Churchill said, 70 years ago, someday science will evolve to the point that we can just produce the chicken we need. We don't have to produce the entire animal. So, there's this vision for cell-based meat for a very long time. I think it's a lot about how you communicate it, though, because many people, the biggest diet trend in the United States is clean eating, which is all about eating whole foods, minimally processed. And so, that rubs up against some of these new foods, whether it's plant-based or cell-based. And if we don't find a way of sort of communicating how those are different, but also important, then we may not get to use those technologies. The people that are producing them are very excited about it, and they seem convinced that consumers will be there. But so much of it comes down to how we communicate it, whether or not people love it. I always say that people love innovation almost as much as they despise change. And there's no place that people despise change more than in the food they eat, because food is what brings us together with family and friends. And if you mess with my food, you're messing with my family, and people don't like that. But if we don't change food, everything will change.
I mean, it's fascinating. That trade-off there is really interesting, because on the one hand, you've got this trend, you've got the clean eating trend, but then no doubt the other major trend which has developed over the last few years, mainly with the millennials, is more the environmental kind of trade-off.
Yeah.
People are really focused on that. So they're almost looking at some of the solutions out there, the Impossible Burger, for instance, as having less of a less impact on the environment. So they're drawn there, although it's probably very different from the other trend, which is around the clean eating side.
Right.
So
yeah. Well,
that's
Well, I mean, 2019, the biggest diet trend of 2019 was clean eating and whole foods. The biggest IPO, public offering, was Beyond Meat. So, you have the two biggest things in food and ag were diametrically opposed, and in many ways are moving in different directions. And that's a lot of what I do as a food futurist, is to help people to understand consumers, one, there could be two different consumers. They could be wanting different things. But two, sometimes the same consumer at different parts of the day wants different things. And the future, isn't just one possible future. There are many possible futures. And so we could have a future in which all of these exciting innovations, whether it's plant-based, cell-based, or improvements in biotechnology, are given up, and we end up with a less sustainable planet, but the food that people want. Or we could end up with a future where there's a place for all of these technologies, and the production is actually more sustainable. So there are all of these possible futures, and we need to figure out which one is our preferred future and find a way to get there.
Yeah, absolutely. So, just in your view, I was having a discussion with my wife this morning, who was asking me about we should be buying organic food. It's a really classic discussion going in today, and I said, why don't you, less pesticides? It's better for you. I said, I'm going to ask a guy that knows about that today. So, we speak about myths, and we speak about points of view that we sometimes get stuck with. Well, what are the benefits of organic as opposed to non-organic from a consumer perspective?
Sure. Now, many people buy organic products primarily for health reasons, but that's probably not the main reason one might want to do it. The reduction, it's not really that they're produced with no pesticides, of course. They're produced without synthetic pesticides. Many natural pesticides are highly toxic. The organic industry, there would be no wine, organic wine, without copper sulfate, which is one of the most toxic compounds in the world. And so, organic is not synonymous with safe. On the other hand, there is absolutely a role for organic food production. So today in the United States, many large farmers are using low-till and no-till agriculture, which means they're not tilling the soil as much, which is good. And they're also using things called cover crops, which are grown between growing seasons in order to maintain the soil and avoid or reduce erosion, but also to add some nutrients back into it. And those are two ideas that really had their genesis in organic food production. And so what I see is the best benefit of organic production is that they are solving problems in ways that no conventional farmer would ever think about. And because of that, they're coming up with solutions that we just wouldn't have had otherwise. And then we get to transfer that knowledge over to conventional agriculture. And that's how you scale it. You don't scale it by turning, 4% of organic production into 5% of organic production. That will never happen fast enough, to have much of an impact on the planet. On the other hand, if we can take those ideas and 2 years from now, 3 years from now, have most farmers using cover crops, that could have a dramatic impact very, very quickly. It took us 50 years to go from 0% organic to 5% organic. We need to solve this problem by 2050. We really haven't talked about that, but I always tell people that the next 30 years are not just the most important 30 years there have ever been in the history of agriculture, and they're the most important 30 years there will ever be in the history of agriculture. We have to get it right. So we will either get to 2050 and we will have saved our rivers, our lakes, and our aquifers, or we will be screwed. Because after 2050, population begins to decline precipitously because we're not having more kids. 100% of the growth between now and 2050 is because of people living longer. It's a good news story. After that, it slows down. So every day between now and 2050, it gets harder to feed the world. Every day after 2050, it will get easier to feed the world. And so we need to figure out how to get there without screwing up the planet.
So what do you think then? Do you think, will we get there? What's your sense of whether that will happen?
Well, I tell people I'm a science optimist. I have no doubt that science and technology, changes in consumer eating patterns, all of those things can solve our problems. No doubt whatsoever. But I'm also a regulatory pessimist. I'm not at all convinced that we will be able to use the tools we need in order to get there. And that's why trust is so important. That's why conversations like this are so critical, because if we can't convince the public that we deserve the opportunity to deploy these technologies, well, then shame on us for not being worthy of of that trust.
Yeah, absolutely. So tell me then, what can the industry do? What should it be doing, to help build that trust and save our planet?
Well, it's mostly about relationships. If you can get to know the other side, you can build bridges, whether it's with consumers or conservation groups or others. That's where these changes are going to happen. When you get to know somebody, you may disagree with them, but you don't think they're actively working to undermine you. I have lots of friends that are idiots and don't know anything about food and ag, but still have opinions about it. But I still love them, and I think that they're doing their best to save the planet. So what I tell people is my personal mission is to de-escalate the tension in our food system so that we can all get about our business of saving the planet in our own way. And so we do that, though, by building those relationships. And in particular, I think that it's conservation groups that the agriculture industry needs to build those relationships with, because I think currently there is a lot of distrust between the two. And yet the conservation groups care passionately about saving those forests. And if you look at organizations like the World Resources Institute, they really get those trade-offs. They understand that low productivity agriculture is good locally, but it's a disaster globally. And that if we all produced our food, in one way, it's not going to work. If the US produced all of our food organically, next year, we would be fine. We'd produce enough food to feed everybody. But we export an enormous amount of food, corn and soy and canola and cotton. So somebody else would have to produce all of that. And the most likely places for the corn and soy is Brazil and Argentina. So, if we didn't do it, we would immediately contribute, an extra, 50% for deforestation over what would have occurred in order to meet that demand. And so, it's not about good or bad or right or wrong. It's about choices and consequences. People have the right to make a choice, but they have to live with the consequence.
Yeah, no, that's great. Absolutely. Let me just got a couple of other questions. Just looking ahead at some of the big trends you see in the innovation space. And you've got the indoor farming kind of revolution really kind of taking place at the moment. Lots of capital and investment in building, localized kind of farms, as it were, indoor farms.
Yeah.
Do you have a view and opinion about the role indoor farming can kind of play in solving the crisis or the challenges ahead, I should say?
So controlled environment agriculture is sometimes called, vertical farms and other things. So I think there's a difference between vertical farms and controlled agriculture in general, which is more like greenhouses, and you see a lot of that in places like the Netherlands. I think vertical farms themselves are going to find that there are really only niches for them, because one of the challenges of vertical farms is simply that, if you were to ask what are the cost drivers of vertical farms, the answer would be energy and real estate. Well, in rural America or rural Europe, those two things are free. You get your sun energy from the sun, and land is cheap. So if your cost drivers are things that are basically free, it's going to be really hard to drive your cost down lower than free. And so they're always going to have a challenge competing with controlled environment someplace else. But there still could be a niche for them. Part of what's good about it is, though, it brings agriculture closer to the consumer, and consumers get to understand agriculture in a way that they have, just lost touch with over time. But it's also developing lots of innovative ideas in terms of, water use and lighting and all of these things, all of which can be used by those greenhouses and other farming techniques. So, it's a little bit like the organic of the controlled environment world, these vertical farms. So the ideas will spread and be applied in lots of places that, the developers probably aren't expecting. But they can be highly productive, but it's more likely going to be, continue to be for specialty crops, whether it's fruits and vegetables and things like that, than, the large row crops of corn and wheat things. So it can have an impact on access to quality food, but it's never going to really have an impact on, the environmental sustainability of agriculture generally, because 95% of the land is really in those larger crops that you just can't produce in a vertical or a controlled environment system.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Yeah, very interesting. Very interesting. Dynamics as as we look ahead. But this has been a fabulous conversation. I could, as I said to you, I could talk to you for hours. So I massively appreciate you coming on and sharing your views and opinions around this. And just tell us a little bit about the company you've set up, and because some of your branding and posting is just fantastic. So maybe just give us a couple of minutes about what the company does and how you're operating.
Sure. So the company is Futurity, and it's a food foresight company. We sort of work with food tech startups and big food brands, helping them understand what does the future of food look like, where are consumer trends and attitudes going, and how do organizations get ahead of a trend so they don't get run over by them. Because many organizations talk about what's the hot next new thing. Well, if you're a food company and somebody says this is what's going to be hot in 2021, by the time you bring out a product, they're already moved on to the next cycle. So instead of talking about trends, I like to work with organizations to talk about the forces that shape the trends that others are talking about. Because once you begin to understand those forces, you have a real opportunity to get ahead of the trends. And so that, that's part of what I'm helping companies do. And also to de-escalate that tension. How do they talk about their products so that consumers understand how they fit into that future? So it's trying to reduce some of that angst out there in the food world that currently exists.
Yeah, that sounds great. It sounds really interesting, and I wish you all the very, very best with that. So Thank you very much indeed, Jack. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you for having me.